Welcome everyone to cycle 5 of READance. We had a brief break for the past about like half a year or so, I think, that we didn't really have a reading group going on. So we're very, very happy and excited again to resume this group. Lakshmi, who's here, and Santosh, who's here with us. I'm sure you would have, you know them from previous cycles, those of you who have joined us. This has just been a venture that three of us have been running together for a while now. And it's been a very, very interesting way for me personally to engage with reading, which I might otherwise not, be disciplined enough to do. And in fact, I was just mentioning to Lakshmi and Santosh earlier today that so the book choice for this cycle was Lakshmi's recommendation. And this is precisely the kind of book that I definitely find a challenge to read. It takes me a bit of time to sit down with this material and make sense of it. But I will not do it unless I have to turn up, on an evening and, hear what everyone else has to say and share something as well. So I'm personally, again, very, very excited to be starting to read something which has actually been perhaps one of the most challenging reads that we've had so far, both in terms of volume and content, I believe. For those of you who've already been with us, you know the grind, you know how we do this. But for those of you joining us for the first time, a very, very quick brief. This is an extremely informal group, okay? There is no particular method we follow in how we run the sessions at all. The whole idea is for us to, like I said, have a space where we commit to coming back, right? Reading those 10 or 20 pages each time. And also, I personally, again, find that collective perspective of what everybody else is thinking about the same thing that you're reading helps cement ideas in my head in a much better way. So that's really the purpose of this. So we keep it as informal as possible. You can unmute and speak and express yourself whenever you'd like. Questions are very welcome. Quotations or particular paragraphs of reading from the pages that we've read. Anything that particularly stood out to you or you would like for the group to discuss. Anything, absolutely any which way that each one of us steers this discussion is, I think, where it goes. So yeah, and with that, I think I will throw it open to the group. The one thing that we are also trying to do this time, and we will share the link with you on the WhatsApp group, is just creating a little document of sort of glossary, more like a glossary and a bibliography of sorts, putting together terms that may be technical terms that may be, easy to have like a quick reference to, as well as we're trying to put together like a set of references of the kind of authors and texts that have been, referred to with a certain set of timelines, once again, so that we find it as just a ready reckoner of sorts. We'll share this link on the group and we'll make it like an editable document for everybody so everyone can contribute, okay? It doesn't have to be a linear thing at all. So anything, if you're reading and if something is there in your mind, you can just go and put it into the document, okay? With that, I will throw the room open for us to start discussing. So yeah, welcome everyone. I'm really excited for this. So just to probably give it some direction, I think it's very convenient that the first 20 pages that we've read are also kind of divided into smaller headers. So it's maybe easy for us to go if we kind of take one header at a time. So I'm just going to throw open first the first 4 to 5 pages, which is essentially the introduction, right? What was aesthetics in classical India? Please unmute and share as you would like.
I'm happy to perhaps start off. So I think the first few pages, I found it quite interesting how he lays out the comparison between Western aesthetics and philosophy as a discipline versus how we're approaching Indian aesthetics. And I think that was particularly interesting because I and the author as well, I come from a background where I've studied analytical philosophy and Western aesthetics. But then there's always a debate about how you view aesthetics or concepts of art from a different culture. So it goes back and speaks to the debate on whether art is itself a cultural notion. So is the concept of art something that is born or is specific to a particular culture? Or is it something that is shared across cultures? Do all cultures have a similar understanding of the concept of art? And in those lines, I think through the rest of the chapter, so in the first few pages, I think he sets up that distinction nicely in asking, well, were Indian scholars working on aesthetics, were they interested in the same concept of art as has been studied in the West? And then I think in the later parts of the chapter, he goes on to make that assumption of that it's fine to compare them parallel. And I found this both a very accessible introduction because he's drawing that comparison with the West. But as I was reading this, there was also a question that I was asking of how comparable these cases are and how much it makes sense to draw a distinction between the two. So I think one thing that stood out to me is also when he says in the first couple of chapters, he says at least early theorists of Rasa weren't so much interested in this from the point of view of religion, and that spirituality came in later, but instead it started off in dramatic art, and then they moved the concept of Rasa into literature and into literary meaning. That for me also, I guess, is a broader question then of how they understood Rasa or art as a whole. Is it so he tries to draw out those conceptual distinctions, but I'm also interested in how we think about art today and whether this makes sense or what our views of that are. So yeah, I appreciate any other thoughts anyone else has on these pages.
So I think in the first set where he's just sort of setting us up for the rest of the reading in terms of what to expect. There were a couple of things that stood out to me also in terms of how he talks about. He says it's important to understand the thought world of how it, in India, things were thought about, right, at large, before you kind of rush to a definition of aesthetics or a definition of rasa itself, which in itself, although he doesn't sort of elaborate on it in an immediate sense, but I feel it's such an important understanding with which to get into it, because when he makes that comparison, so I don't have any background in Western aesthetics at all, but when he makes that comparisons also, I think he's constantly pointing you towards the fact that you cannot just compare it in a very one-to-one sense and say, okay, here's a definition from here and there, because the evolution of that thought process and how it was, I think, applied at each point of time also matters a lot, right? So it helped me kind of, I think, get my bearings in terms of how to approach, or maybe how not to approach the rest of the reading. One thing also that stood out to me is what is there on the end of page 2, I think, where he talks about the Indian thought, distinction also in art had always been made between creativity, I think, and a formal idea of beauty itself. So if I understood what he's saying right, he's saying that even though there were say critiques of works of art per se, right, individual works of art, that was never really a core concern or a central concern of the Indian way of thinking, because we're always concerned with the formality of how, right? What are the constituent elements, or how do you go about doing this, versus an individualistic, having an individual interpretation or having a personal voice, or what we call individual creativity today. So that was something interesting for me. also looking at it from the point of view of where we are today, right, with our own art forms and how we tend to approach it in terms of what we feel important. So yeah, that was one thing that stood out to me from that first section.
I have 3 points that actually that I kind of found very interesting. One was the word aesthetics and its connection to modern Western philosophical terms versus to how it's kind of interpreted today, like different uh, in the different definitions that you use today. So it was confusing for me in the very start to understand aesthetics by itself because I felt like it kind of had a different approach later. Then I found the other thing that really struck was how a line was kind of directing towards classical Indian thinkers who did not separate art theory from philosophy, religion, or psychology within that kind of web. So I kind of felt that I was drawing myself to that kind of a thinking. And I think that it kind of also, there was one part where I don't have it marked, but there's one section where I thought that how it kind of sits in the broader cultural and spiritual context as well, and how the word kind of evolves. So I think this was from the first 4 pages till we go into Rasa and the poet. I just found it very connected to a lot of these terminologies and understanding. But I think the word aesthetics was something that kept evolving with its definition for me in that point. But again, I don't know how that definitions is translated because there's one point that I think this was page 3, which was put in brackets with that. Remember that even in English, aesthetics is not found in the intended sense before the 18th century. So the evolution of that word by itself and how that's kind of that I'm looking forward to actually understanding how the word sits in for the next few discussions as well, because it's kind of evolving through it, is what I felt.
I like the questions he poses. So I think page 2, he lists 4 questions. What identifies as art? What do artists do? Can we ever understand an artwork? And then follows it up by saying none of the Indian authors specifically pose these questions. But that seems to be a primary concern, I guess, of Western aesthetics and what they seek to do. And then he also, the next page, he says, why describe anything as aesthetic or why respond emotionally to art? There he says that, yes, that was a more primary focus of Indian aesthetics. And maybe I get the idea that some sort of implicit assumption was made that emotion has to be tied to art. Whenever the Indian aesthetics said anything about artwork, that is something I want to understand why he feels that way and where that actually comes from. And towards the end of the page and later, so I also feel like in the first few pages he sets out a very brief but sort of concise history of Western aesthetics. So he talks about Alexander Baumgarten and some other, the first time aesthetics was even conceived of as an idea or something to be discussed about. And that there's a nice summary there of like 3 lines of art related to religion, how it was initially linked to religion in Western aesthetics, but then came to be something different, and the link between aesthetics and modernity. So he very nicely presents the intellectual history from a Western point of view, and then nicely also summarizes it towards the end of that. Because I think that's sort of the comparison starting point that he wants to have people go ahead with. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on this portion? Questions? Lines that stood out? You can also use the chat box if you want to just share perhaps lines that, that sort of stand out for you instead of reading. So please share in whichever way that you're comfortable.
I think I was also curious more generally about, because the role of emotion is central to the Rasa theory and to aesthetics. I wondered if there's a broader literature that is ever questioned? Because within the Rasa theory itself, it seems to have been a very strong source of critical discourse over the years of what this as a concept should mean. But I wondered if there was any literature that challenged the idea that art had to be connected to emotions in some way. Because there's a very, at least in contemporary Western philosophy, there's a very strong piece of literature that would critique the idea that art requires emotion, or that art, or the purpose of art is to invoke a sort of emotional response. So I wondered if there's been any parallel to that discussion in the Indian context, or if that was sort of taken as an assumption that was taken.
I'm going to leave that as an open question on the chat. And of course, if anybody knows of any references, please sort of leave that over there so that we can all return to it. But maybe we can move on to the second part of the essay. And of course, it's not watertight, so we can keep coming back, revisiting ideas in the first part as well. So the next few pages where he talks about Rasa in the poet. So overall, my sensibility, or rather my impression on this specific part was, although it's a very, very, tiny sort of a portion, but I think it's extremely relevant to performers particularly. I found that it spoke to me very directly in terms of, what is it that I do with myself as a dancer today, right, on stage? Because this, in fact, is something that I've heard, my teacher very directly tell me and discuss with me, this idea of what is important. Is it important for you to experience that emotion, or for you to be full of that emotion in that moment? Or the distinction that eventually, of course, gets made in the later parts of our reading, which he says is also a distinction that comes much, much later in the discussion of Rasa, is the distinction between who experiences it. Is it the creator, the author, the artist, or is it the consumer or the audience or the reader in whatever sense? So it definitely spoke to me very directly. And I'll leave it open to others to share. I'm going to see what I have. So the one line that I've marked also here in this part was in page 6, the last paragraph of that section, where he says, yet over time, Indian thinkers would move far away from this view and never really return, for they came to understand that Rasa cannot be a response to the real world, the world outside the theater. For there, grief is truly grief. It was precisely the difference between the two experiences that became their preoccupation. So the interesting learning for me out of this was, because of what I have heard in practice today, and personally what I've heard from my teachers, my impression was this was the discourse throughout the history of Indian art, right? And I think the simplification that also, I have tended to make as a Bharatanatyam dancer always is, somehow everything that you do discuss is there in the Natya Shastra, right? Direct connection 2000 years back kind of a thing. So it was a very important learning for me to see the subtlety that existed between how initially maybe the ideas were posed or interpreted, and how it was clarified much later to mean this. Because this is the way I have, at least personally, understood performative art and the idea of rasa, right? What your experience even as an audience is while watching something is the ability to watch yourself also enjoy, right? And it's not the real, it's a recreation of the emotion, and you understand that you're recreating that emotion, which is also what makes it exciting and powerful, and sparks something off in your brain as an activity you want to go back and wantedly do or re-experience every time, right? So yeah, that's kind of what I have marked from that section.
So on that very section that you marked, it was actually very insightful to even understand. So when he says grief is truly grief in the real world, but when an audience is actually experiencing it, it definitely is not grief, but it is somewhere close. That makes me wonder how nuanced the emotional scape um, of all of us is, and how much more layered, and as like performing artists, how is it that we can bring them as close to a real world emotion as possible? It was yeah, that is something that interested me as well.
I think even when he's describing Valmiki and the first shloka that is written, he talks about Valmiki himself feeling sorrow because he saw the bird losing its mate. But the expression he calls in the poetry as pity. So that distinction in the words itself, which I feel comes out in that distinction between bhava and rasa, that's what that a lot of that part of this section talks about. So and then of course I think Valmiki himself suddenly realizes what he's done. Like, this is something he has never done before, uttered like a shloka before, or given this kind of, or generated something that could maybe make someone experience not grief but pity. So that was, I mean, interesting way to look at things, I guess. And the weird part is he was a witness, right? Valmiki was a witness. It's not that he was seeing another mate lose its own mate. That was feeling tragic. I mean, feeling the tragedy, and then he was so many like perspectives over here.
And that also raises the very essential question, because I think somewhere it does, maybe in this part is where it talks about, the passion of the creator, or some word as such, because it made me think then, is it essential for the artist or the creator to have had that experience, or to have that experience, right? Which is like a very real, because from Valmiki's example, that's what we're saying. There's a real emotional experience which results in a certain expression of it, right? And then there are others who can consume and sort of have a re-experience of it, so to say. But then what is the stand eventually on whether or not it is essential for the artist to have had a real world experience, so to say, right? From the words that he uses.
Just kind of what we are just while we go into this week, and also to all of you, one thing very well, or I think that's the whole point of also to kind of talk about how the ideas are not monolithic or not like frozen in time and it changes. I think that is a very well set out, that all these ideas and concepts are also changing with the time. So I think that's the greatest takeaway, because sometimes, as Apurva was saying, that we always go back to Natya Shastra, but Natya Shastra was not the primary text throughout the course of, let's say, the last 2 millennium. It is coming and going and coming and going. So I think those parts, I think that's something, there's a overall like a zooming out part. I think
that was very helpful. I'm a historian, so it was not very surprising, but I have never really gone into these like nuances, the complexity of these ideas. And as dancers, we take it like, oh, this was there 2000 years old, which is true, but then that had not remained fixed over the years. So I think for me, and I'm also listening that all of us are also found that to be very interesting. So I thought like, yeah, this is something I'm taking away overall, but also this section as well.
Yeah, very, very true. Definitely, I think that part is something that I've resonated with as well. I was just also thinking about the question that Lakshmi posed in terms of texts that possibly discuss, whether emotion is essential to arts. And it just struck me that so far, at least in this setup that he has created, it is largely a discussion of the Sanskrit texts, right, that discuss emotion as well. So it might be very interesting to see at least I'm aware that the Tamil has, right, a long history of texts which again discuss in a very, very theoretical, fashion these same ideas. So maybe that could be a place that we can look, before next week. We'll go and see what counterpart the Tamil text perhaps give us as well. Yeah. So maybe we move ahead also to the next section and start addressing specific things in Rasa scene in the play. So that's pages 6 to 9, while also keeping the general discussion alive. So
Interesting here, the starting point of rasa is something that originated from emotions that could be performed or seen, and as combinations of these, and then ultimately in the later passages, he says it moves away from that when it starts applying this theory prominently to literature. I think what I find interesting here is there's a particular aphorism, page 9. The second paragraph to the end, he says, just as discerning people relish tastes, discerning viewers relish the stable emotions and they feel joy. He says this comes from perhaps a reconstructed version of the Nadi Shastra, and that it's held sway is an important feature. I think what I'm interested in is perhaps why the change. So when it moved to literature, and moving from things that could be performed and seen to perhaps looking into the formal properties of text itself, I wonder why there's also why that a particular aphorism stayed, both across, so even as the lens of interpretation changed between perhaps artistic disciplines and between the theories of rasa itself and where it's found, there seems to be definitely a strong implication that there is the need for a stable emotion that contributes to making art what it is. I think I found that quite a distinctive feature.
yeah, it would be interesting to see if he addresses that at any other point of time in the, as we read ahead in the book, because you're absolutely right that in these 20 pages, there just seems to be a very, that's the foundation on which he builds everything else, right? The assumption is that emotion is very much, that's not something we're debating at all. And then everything sort of takes it forward from there. Yeah.
Maybe a segue from what Lakshmi just said. Something that stood out to me in the, I mean, Rasa in the play, and when he is talking about Natya Shastra, is where he mentions 8 rasas, and somewhere at the end of the 20 pages, he also says uh, he speaks about the emotion of the emotionless, where he addresses Shanta, I believe. Um, I mean, I have not read Natya Shastra, but looking at it, it makes me wonder if how Shanta became a part of the Navarasas that we um, have today. Was it originally in Natya Shastra? And if yes, I don't know how he has, I don't know, specifically just listed 8 emotions that is in the treatise. So, yeah, that is something that I noticed.
Yeah, I'm also, I cannot reference this, but I've often heard this debate of, is it 8 rasas or is it 9 rasas? And my understanding from what I've heard is that the Shanta as a rasa was only sort of added or accepted into the pantheon much later, right? That's very kind of loosely sort of the debate that I've heard. But the additional thing that he says somewhere in here, I don't know if it's this part of the chapter, of this interesting thing of why only those 8 rasas was because also the emotion needed to be performable. I think that was one of the things that he says, which is a very interesting thing that I did not know of earlier, right? So counting as the basic emotions those that you can actually perform or convey. And there is that discussion somewhere about the mother's love, right? Being a perfect example for that is something that it can be an emotion that can always remain very internal and, doesn't have a direct sort of way of expression. So, and the evolution of that too, right? Because if the evolution happened from theater towards literature, which means you're taking it away from, like, your understanding of emotion is going beyond the boundary of what needs to be shown, right, physically through the body or otherwise, then the idea of emotion itself starts to expand and include a lot many more sort of subtle and, I guess, nuanced emotions. So, yeah.
So I think V. Raghavan has written a book on exactly this. It's titled Number of Rasas, and he talks about the different debates and arguments for including or not including Shanta, whether from a literary or a dramatic point of view. It's a nice book to reference. It's on Internet Archive.
What is it called? If you would mind mentioning.
Number of Rasas.
Number of rasas. Okay.
I haven't read it completely. But the one question that I felt while reading the first 4 pages, only the introductory portion. I'm sorry that I'm taking everybody back to that portion. But the one question that I had was, there's a line that he mentions how precisely rasa comes into being became the central problem of Sanskrit uh, literary theatre. I think this question, I think if anybody has any, uh, I have as to how can this, if anybody can take it from there and uh, could tell your point of view on what do you think of this particular line that he says, that rasa that comes into being is the main problem of Sanskrit literary theory. I think this question really stuck with me when I was reading the introductory portion. So if anybody of you have any thoughts or anything, we would love to hear.
I'm not sure if he mentions anywhere the first time the word rasa was used in the context of art. So I also haven't read the entire portion. So I was also asking that may be relevant to like there's that sentence. So it is somewhere in I guess literary analysis and then taken into dramatic analysis. But yeah, of course, use of it as more than just taste in the sense of that the other thing. Taste as in not rasa, as in something you can taste in your mouth, but something that's a indirect feeling or an emotion from artwork.
But also, I like the way he talks about the Western aesthetics of how it's more logic based, and also how he talks about Immanuel Kant and all of these, how they shunned off rasa as purely subjective because, and this is what he quoted, shunted off to be purely subjective realm and relegated to a place between skeptics quotation marks, which is to say that it's only subjective and not objective for the Western aesthetics. And this is on page 4 of the read. So he starts off from there and then he goes into, I'm sorry, I didn't pick up the question of how you said how Sanskrit, the primary question of Sanskrit was they didn't know the emotion, or to some degree, right? I didn't mark that question, but the way I got stuck when he said in page 2, I guess, where he said Shiva and all of these deities, though, yeah, I think furthermore, almost everything outside the literary realm, let alone the cultural realm, remained outside classical Indian aesthetic analysis, including nature. Though Shiva was a dancer, God in India was generally not an artist. There are exhaustive normative, and then he goes on to describe how he thinks it is. So going from there and getting to Bharata, where Bharata's text and his ideology was the formation of how Indian aesthetics or Indian art to be talked about. Even now we quote Bharata said this in our literary dialogues with art, and I've seen this discussion happen in conferences. But going from there, where Bharata is of the strong opinion that it has to be felt by the artist, which later is ridiculed by Anandavardhana in I think page number 9, where he talks about Anandavardhana's liberation of rasa of poetry from the prison house of rhetoric is not what earned him his important place in the intellectual history of aesthetics. His most historically consequential idea concerned the communicative medium of rasa in a world of purely textual and no longer performative. How, he asked, or at least this is the question buried below the surface of his answer, can rasa be made known when there is nothing to see, when it is the rasa of literature that is heard? And I think this is again goes back to how we choreograph and look at pieces, where we take up a word and then draw meanings into Sanchari based on the word, because that word is concerned with the poet and what he thinks and how we want to interpret. So I thought all of that was very, very complex, but also I could see, oh, this is how we look at literature to poetry to song to dance.
I just found the headings quite interesting as well. So he says rasa in the poet, and then there's a session where you say rasa heard in the poem. So it's quite, I wonder how it's kind of seen versus to rasa seen in the play rather than rasa experienced in the play, or what is it like? Is it the scene rasa experienced as a performer, and then there's a discussion on it? So it's quite interesting, even with the choice of words when they kind of categorized it for writing. I think that was very interesting for me. And I think what really struck to me was also that sentence where, going back to what Anand was saying, was one of the most important and fertile yet intra-traceable question for the entire subsequent aesthetic tradition is what Bharata thought rasa is. So again, the kind of infinite loop that is kind of building there, but then not completely giving away that that's what it is. Like it's not like vice versa kind of a thing, but there is a sense of direction that's been given there to the kind of mapping that they're doing. But I really like the choice of words, even in the way they kind of subjected the whole thing.
I thought it was like perspectives, right? I mean, he's kind of saying, look at it, what is written in the poetry versus a person who was actually experiencing the poetry, to how would you relate to the person listening to the poetry. I just thought it was kind of touching upon perspectives of showcasing that Rasa. But yeah.
Yeah, I felt that too. I mean, I felt this section is totally about doing a trajectory of what are the thoughts and where it is going from. I don't see Pollock coming out with any argument as such for now. But I thought like it's like, okay, how these concepts were getting translated from dramaturgy to literature, and the difficulty of like there are the things that if language cannot express it, if it's actually being experienced. I think those are the debates that were happening, coming and going. Like I couldn't find him taking a stand here at all at this point. Hopefully it will.
Yeah, I think that's fair because he's only giving us the also a chronological progression of what are all the ideas that existed. How did it move either from one to the other, or phases where ideas coexisted as well. So yeah, but also just I think responding to what Yashashvi said, he does say in at least a couple of places this word of caution about Bharata and how we understand what Bharata himself in fact said, right? Because one thing he mentions is that I think there is what we know of is largely a reconstructed text from maybe the 9th or 10th century in Kashmir, because we don't really have original text to sort of go back to. And this is around the same time where the whole argument landscape seems to be undergoing that change. So in one sense. And the second is he also talks about then how do you interpret, even if that you take that to be the original verse written by Bharata, how we understand those verses through commentaries, and the chief commentaries that survive are also post 9th century commentaries in the way I understood it. So I think that also becomes a very important thing to bear in mind when we keep referencing back to Natya Shastra, right? Because we ourselves are not accessing the Natya Shastra either in its original form or in its perhaps in its original thought process. I don't know.
No, I actually agree with that. I just feel that he cautions multiple times to say, do you really know the mind of the author? Or is it an interpretation that you have projected on to, what he might have thought he said? So I think it's kind of like take a step back, because you really don't know what's in the mind of a person who's written that. But more your interpretation and sometimes your projected interpretations of what you think.
But I also think it's
you would like to see.
You were saying something, please. Okay, okay. Yeah, but I also think about maybe that was the implication that something had to be produced at that time. Because before that, maybe it was taken for granted that emotion and literature were just part and parcel. It was always a debate about, oh, is this supposed to be an emotion, or is this literature, is this performative art that needs to be emoted, and hence Rasa should be a part of it. It was only when somebody, or knowing the history, maybe it was important at that point for it to be in a legal or a written format as to what each emotion or each scripture or art was in general, rather than before that, where it was just debate after debate of what is relevant to that time, when the historical Western historians came and debated and said that, oh, emotion, and if it's person to person, it can be subjective and it cannot be logical and it cannot be documented. Maybe that was the time that Bharata came in and said that here's the legal treatise that we are putting forth as what rasa is, what art is, what are the constraints and boundaries of art. And the later always it's later was it presented more before If not, then that needed at that point.
Interesting metaphysical question on what they considered the purpose of Rasa theory in each of these points. So as Bharata's interest in it would seem from his characterization, was it just that he was trying to note down the formal properties of an artwork? So he was trying to list what it would take for a successful piece of theater, for instance. But then later theorists seem to expand this into a concept of aesthetic engagement. So I guess, I mean, I think we'd need a closer reading of the original text itself. But what was his purpose of invoking Rasa there? Was it just a tool for analysis, or was he trying to draw deliberately a broader theory of aesthetics? And I also thought it raised an interesting question on what art itself is. Is it necessarily, so when you think of, so does art, what is the art object? Does its purpose come from the feelings or emotions of the creator, or is it from the formal properties of the artwork itself? So for instance, at least in discussion in the West, there's cases or questions that would arise. So if you were to look at a painting from a different period of time, or from a different culture where you don't know what the intent of the author is, can you look at the painting and call it art just because it matches with our concept of what's beautiful or what's artistic? Or do we need to have access to that understanding of intent or emotion? And I think I found that as well. So when he speaks about the debate of it moving from theater to the page, that seems to be what's in questions of if the person itself isn't there. So in the case of a performance, it's the artist who's performing, experiencing the emotion, whereas in the case of literature, it's already written and that's just an artifact. So that intention isn't directly accessed. So that's what he seems to be saying, at least the early debate on whether or not Rasa could be extended to the literary realm surrounded that, of whether you needed that immediate access to the artist's emotions or to their intention.
I would like to add to that. Can we say that Rasa is an aesthetic experience only, or should it be a knowledge that needs to be actively acquired? Because like on page 5, it says that the poet, if the poet is filled with passion, the whole world of his poem will carry the Rasa. But then if that same poem is translated into dance, and if it is, for example, it is the emotion of a mother, and that person has no experience of being a mother, then that person still carries that same passion. And now if the dance is in, for example, is in Tamil language and is being presented to an audience who is foreign to that language, then what happens to the rasa? Is it still intact? So can we still say that rasa is an aesthetic experience, or is it something that needs to be cultivated and experienced and acquired as a form of knowledge?
So just taking one step back, Lakshmi, addressing what you were just saying, I'm just thinking about what you're saying. Because when he talks about the translation almost of the idea of rasa, literally like taking a theory and applying it to literary works, right? Largely to me, his arguments surrounded like literally, like what are the words? I mean, what are the devices that you use in order to create emotion, right? And let's leave so whether it's emotion to be experienced by the reader or the emotion experienced by the writer. But he talks about, of course, like it starts from a very rhetoric sort of a understanding, right? That like what kind of language do you need to use to create emotion? It moves from there to this idea of like emotion is expressed only when you do not state it as is, right? If I can say it that way, that is, the word itself does not evoke the emotion, although the word means that, right? Sadness means sadness, but just because I use the word, does it evoke that emotion? Now, how do you? Because where in this is he or anybody who in any of these texts which are having these discussions? It seems to be very consumed in the formal constituents of the art itself, or whatever that particular form of art, and doesn't to me seem to address who's experiencing this emotion. So it seems somehow like, they were bound into the discussion of what do you need to do with your body, what you need to do with your words for emotion to be present, but they don't explicitly extend that into because I find your question very interesting, as I hear it, saying that, yes, if I don't access the intent of the artist, then how does this argument break down? But is this what he is, he is saying the texts were proposing, or like, because I definitely didn't sort of go into that loop at all about like accessing the intent of the artist and, whether it is important to what the consumer experiencing emotion. Yes, it's a bit tangled there for me.
Yeah.
So what Lakshmi actually said is quoted by Ananda in his explanation, I think, where he says the literal meaning is not intended at all, as you said, but subordinated by some other meaning. The implicature of rasa occupies a special conceptual niche. It is the only type in the second category where the succession of meanings from literal to intended, that is, from a disaggregated aesthetic elements to the unified emotional meaning produced by them and viewed as a totality, is not registered by the reader, but instead arises with the apparent immediacy. So I think Ananda spoke about this, where he said it has to be from the person who's reading it rather than felt by the performer, at least in the literary sense of how he broke down what is literature that is heard, where he's answering it. And this is in page number 13, first paragraph.
I think I see that as a part of also the feature of what he says when it moves from being a focus on what the artist is doing, the conceptions of rasa is located in the formal properties of the artwork, to eventually moving into a concept where in the latter years it becomes a two-way exchange of relationships. It's the artist expressing something that the other spectator shares. So it seems to the properties is art square described toward about the that it's there's in page 11, I think he phrases this. He says, whether the rasas and the emotions, given that they're the sources of the highest literary beauty, are ornaments of the literature or its very life force, will not be a subject for consideration lest it unduly lengthen the book. But and this is a quote that he pulls from Utpata's commentary. But then he says this question will be answered almost immediately in the successive pieces of literature as they go on to discuss whether its sources in its implication or if it's a direct conception, so how it ought to be identified to be related to the formal properties strictly of the artwork itself, or is it coming from that experience? And I think it's a consequence if you say rasa is a shared experience, and you need to know, or at least have a sense of what the intent of the author is. If you're looking at a painting or an artifact or even a piece of literature where that isn't clear, then I think they would be saying there isn't that shared experience of rasa, and you need that element of access versus the alternative formalist views, which do think it's a property of the art itself and how things are portrayed. So even if you leave the intention and the experiences of the author, just looking at the work of art, you can derive an experience from it. So I think I found that distinction interesting.
Maybe we can sort of go into that, lean in a bit to the last part, which is both Rasa in the reader, Rasa after the revolution. If we have any specific thoughts in those sections, and use that to wrap up our discussion for today.
I have a question. In page number 70, he talks about Mimamsa theory. Does anybody have any idea what that is? I did not, I read through the part, but I didn't understand if it was a specific art term or a philosophical term or historical term.
I think Mimamsa is one of the. Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Amrita.
Yeah. So what I understand, Mimamsa is one of the schools of darshanas. So like a philosophical point of view that came. There were six main darshanas in Indian philosophy. There was Purva Mimamsa, Uttara Mimamsa, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and finally the Vedantas. So Mimamsa is more like the a logical, philosophical school of thought or a point of view, which had some idea of the purpose of art or what it's for. So something that had a point of view on the philosophy of art. So yeah. Uttara Mimamsa is what today we call Vedanta. It was the end from coming from or deriving its viewpoints from the ends of the Vedas. So the Upanishads, the ending chapters of the Vedas. So yeah. They had different, so each school of thought had different sort of proponents over centuries. And this is after it's a later Rigvedic period where all of these darshanas came into being.
They have of this school of
No, they had on what then reality is, and that ends up having a bearing on the conception of art. Sankhya and Mimamsa, I've read this somewhere earlier before. There's an author called Mysore Hiryanya. He talks about the Sankhya view of art and the Mimamsa view of art. So whether you take reality as it is, like your known reality to be an illusion, or whether you take art to be, so is art also an illusion of reality, or is art superlative to realities? There's just two differences in that, to the artistic world versus real world, and accordingly the principles from Sankhya and Mimamsa change what you think of rasa and what you think of an artistic experience. That's the idea.
Interesting. I'll read again with this knowledge as to what it means.
So there is again he has a book called Art Experience, a very small short book, and the first essay in that is, I think, what is art. There he discusses the two philosophical points of view.
By whom is this?
Mysore Hiryana, M.R. Hiryana.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll take maybe just a couple of more minutes if there are any, thoughts or questions that we want to close with that we can take away and kind of dwell on for the next week. So I'll give it 2 minutes if anybody is. Okay. If there is nothing specific, nothing on the top of our minds, maybe that's a good point for us to close today's meeting. But please feel always free to share thoughts, questions as they come up, even on the WhatsApp group. That's why we have it, so that we kind of are able to feed into each other's, reading process as well. So feel completely free if anything comes to your mind, even later about this discussion. If you just want to leave it on the WhatsApp group, it's a way for all of us to mull over it and reconvene next week with thoughts. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. This has been great, and we'll see you all in a week's time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Katinska.